experts in disarmament of nuclear war and nuclear weapons, and abolitionists. Delighted to be here with you all. We will begin in just 1 minute. And it is 11:05. Bill Lackenmacher, our tech, and my esteemed colleague, whenever you're ready for us to go live, we are going live.
It's live.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Again, as I mentioned, thank you for joining us from wherever in the world that you're logging on from to be a part of this extremely important conversation with us and our esteemed panelists. As many of you know, this month, the month of October, marks 60 years since the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And right now, with an endless war between the countries of Russia and Ukraine and the JCPOA on hold, we are the closest we have ever been to nuclear war since then. It is unfortunate that only a few members of the House and Senate have risen to the occasion to speak out and to take measures towards de-escalating tensions between the world's nuclear powers. And that is why it is so important that we as abolitionists and people across the country to use this anniversary and this momentum to organize together and demand that our elected officials take a stand and work towards reducing nuclear war. I am here today joined by my esteemed colleague, David Swanson, whom I have the pleasure of introducing, who's going to be co-hosting this panel of discussion with me. David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and a radio host. He's the director of worldbeyondwar.org. His books include War is a Lie. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org. He also hosts Talk World Radio, and he is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee and U.S. Peace Prize recipient. David, please take it away.
Thank you, Hanya, and thank you, everyone. And it is my pleasure to introduce Norman Solomon, who, if he picked this date, picked perhaps the best possible time in our lifetimes for this event. I wish that weren't the case, but I think it is. Norman Solomon is the National Director of RootsAction.org. He is the author of a dozen books, including War Made Easy: How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. He was a Bernie Sanders delegate from California to the 2016 and 2020 Democratic National Conventions. He is also the founder and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. Norman Solomon.
This is an emergency. We don't hear that from Congress. We don't hear that from the White House. These are entities that, rather than encourage and engage in diplomacy, are doing the opposite. And if there's going to be leadership to avert nuclear war, it needs to come from the grassroots. That's why I think we're gathered here today, and that's why people are organizing. And I want to emphasize that if we simply rely on the news media and even the best in Congress, that's not nearly good enough. When there's not diplomacy, when there is insistence on all sides, for instance, in the horrific conflict in Ukraine, that certain positions are non-negotiable, then if that's accepted, then there are no meaningful negotiations whatsoever, and the momentum continues towards what we all dread and realistically fear: essentially global annihilation. So the grassroots leadership can include, in the next couple of weeks, organizing for and implementing protests in the middle of October. And of course, it's easy and understandable for people to feel that events in the world, these dire, horrific, ominous events, already so terrible, that could get so much worse, it's easy to feel that there's nothing we can do about it, to feel immobilized. And yet, while we in the United States have no realistic way of directly affecting events in Russia and from Russia, at least in theory, we have the possibility of affecting the policies of the US government. The policies of the US government are reckless, They are major factors in the last years and months and days of this steadily worsening crisis. And we have, I think, not only the opportunity, but the imperative to say to members of the House and Senate, most particularly those for whom we are constituents, that this is completely unacceptable, that sleepwalking into Armageddon is not acceptable, that the emperor has new clothes, sort of a paradigm, is unacceptable, and that we are going to raise our voices directly in areas where we live. And while it's often forgotten, certainly on Capitol Hill, everybody's elected from somewhere in Congress. And there are district offices for House and Senate members scattered all over the country. So if you're in the United States, you're near one or fairly near one. And so this brings me to the point I want to close on. It's been a lot of discussion, planning, organizing to lead us towards picket lines coming up on October 14th. That's the last weekday, Friday, October 14th, before the anniversary of the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 60th anniversary. And so if you are organizing already for those picket lines, that's terrific. And there's so much outreach that can be done. And Defuse Nuclear War is going to share your information and your contact info with journalists across the country and the world as October 14th gets closer. If you're not yet organizing for some kind of picket or other event on Friday, October 14th, or over that weekend, there are a lot of community events planned, especially for Sunday the 16th. We have 2 weeks. You can do it. And thanks to Ryan Black and others, we have a tremendous array of tools that are online. With one glance, you can get links for how to organize. We will send you free of charge signs if you want for picket lines. And also important, there's a link through which you can let us know what you're doing so we can let journalists around the country and the world know what you're doing. So we can make it happen, and let's do it.
Thank you so much, Norman. That was Norman Solomon, everybody, the inspiration behind this campaign, Defuse Nuclear War. And I do advise everyone to please check us out at diffusenuclearwar.org. We do currently have 95 plus co-sponsor organizations that have joined our coalition, and we look forward to growing this momentum. With that said, because we are very short in time, I'll move over to our next speaker, who I'm very honored to have been working with for the past few weeks to really coordinate this live stream, which we're all a part of, Alan Ware, who is a peace educator, international peace advocate, and a nuclear disarmament campaigner from New Zealand, based in Czech Republic. He serves as a global coordinator of parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, international representative of Aotearoa Lawyers for Peace, director of the Basel Peace Office, and Peace and Disarmament Program Director for World Future Council. In the 1980s and 1990s, he was instrumental in the establishment of peace studies in the New Zealand school curriculum, the abolition of nuclear war and weapons in New Zealand, and the achievement of an International Court of Justice case which affirmed the general illegality of the threat of use of nuclear weapons and the universal obligation to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons. For these campaigns, he has received the Right Livelihood Award, which is the alternative to Nobel Peace Prize. Alan, please take it away.
Anya, thank you so much for that introduction, and commendations on excellent pronunciation of the original and indigenous name of our country, which is Aotearoa. It's also an official name, and our country, as you mentioned, is New Zealand, which is where I originally come from. I'm just trying to set up this, but the command is hidden by the share box. Just a minute. There we go, now I can get it. So yes, I'm currently living in the Czech Republic. I lived for a long time in the United States in New York. in order to be engaged very much in United Nations initiatives on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament, and there have been in Europe for the past 10 years trying to build up connections between the European nuclear disarmament movements and the United States and other global ones, because I believe that cooperation in these is going to be very, very helpful. So thank you very much for the invitation to come on today. I'll be speaking primarily about global initiatives, but also how they interrelate with some of the United States ones, and looking at both strengthening the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons and promoting no first use as a nuclear risk reduction and as a disarmament measure. I'm going to start off first on a positive note. I mean, there's a lot of things to be scared about at the moment, but a positive note is that, and mostly as a result of actions of civil society over the years, we have established a general norm against the use of nuclear weapons, or as Nina Tanawong calls it, a nuclear taboo. Now, it's not robust, it's not absolute, it's not strong, it's wavering a lot, it's been weakened a little bit recently, but so far that taboo has actually meant that nuclear weapons haven't been used yet in armed conflict. There has been some restraint, and so commendations, I say, to civil societies, those who came before us, who have worked so much on campaigns to establish that norm. We are building on that. We have something to work on, and we can show that civil society can be successful in having influence on policymakers, and the fact that we've restrained them so far from using nuclear weapons, even though there have been times when they've been considering it very closely, I think is important. But of course, as I said, that's not absolute. We have to do a lot more to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. In addition to the taboo, I think it's very, very useful to use law, not by itself, but in combination with civil society campaigns. And two key legal developments that can be very helpful in our campaigns are the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion of 1996. And in that opinion, the court, which is the Supreme Court of the United Nations, every member of the United Nations, when they join it, signs the UN Charter, which says that the International Court of Justice is the UN Supreme Judicial Organ. So they respect the decision of the court, even if they don't always implement everything from the decisions. It's got a lot of respect in there. And in 1995-96, the court applied the laws of warfare, which are applicable to all countries, to nuclear weapons to affirm under international customary law, as I'll repeat, that's applicable to all countries and all military forces, the general illegality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. So that's quite a strong legal development. Another one which came in October 2018, which was General Comment 36 of the UN Human Rights Committee. So again, we can use this in our civil society campaigns, which affirm that the threat or use of nuclear weapons violates the right to life, which is Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And already civil society organizations are using that to challenge nuclear weapon states when it comes up for review of the human rights obligations in Geneva. And that's one way that we can keep the pot boiling with regards to the illegality of nuclear weapons. Of course, there's also the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but that's a bit more difficult to apply to the nuclear weapon states because they're not parties to it, but it complements and adds to these other legal initiatives. So these are ones that we can use in our campaign. And just to indicate some of the impact this has, this is the reason I actually changed my career from being a teacher to working in the legal field, was because I saw in the Pacific, where we are, the impact of the nuclear test case in 1974-75 that helped end the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific. It was the court case that was the primary pushed France to stop the atmospheric testing, the final one. So I saw the value of law to move powerful countries. And here, I'll just give two outcomes from the 1996 decision from the International Court of Justice. One is on the United States policy on nuclear weapons use. Prior to that court case, the United States wasn't really applying international humanitarian law and laws of warfare to their single integrated operational plan. And I know this because I had a conversation with the Chief Judge Advocate's Office in 1994 asking how were they applying the law to the various different options of use of nuclear weapons. And they said they weren't. They hadn't been asked to do that. So there was no determination from within the legal system and the US military on which uses of nuclear weapons might be illegal or not. After that, we actually saw in the hearings in the US Senate Those hearings were held under the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2017. We heard from Robert Keller, the former head of US Strategic Command, when asked what would happen if the president asked Stratcom to undertake an illegal order of use of nuclear weapons. The reply wasn't, well, there wouldn't be an illegal order because the president has authority to do that. That was if there was an illegal order, military operations people within Stratcom who are doing this would be required to indicate to the president that is illegal and could refuse the order. So we see now that the law is being applied within the United States. Maybe not as well as we would like, but it is having some impact. We also have seen in Russia the same. In 1999, Russia's new strategic doctrine on nuclear weapons actually quoted from the International Court of Justice restrictions on the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And we saw that again in April 2022, when Putin announced threat to possibly use nuclear weapons in Ukraine if NATO forces got involved there. And Sergei Lavrov came out a couple of days later and said, actually, the policy of Russia with regards to nuclear weapons is only to use when Russia itself is threatened. So he was referring to some of the restrictions put on by the court. So using law, I think, is very important. We can elevate it as civil society, can have an influence on policymakers. Moving on now to no first use, I mentioned that's the other thing that we're working a lot on in order to add more restraints on the use of nuclear to prevent a nuclear war taking. So the key points about advancing no first use are a few. Firstly, if no one uses nuclear weapons first in a conflict, then there's no use of nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a little obvious. That doesn't always mean that no first use policy equates with nuclear weapons never being used first, but it pushes us along that line to, again, preventing the use of nuclear weapons in war. Also, no first use policies restrict planning and preparation for use. They constrain it. At the moment, the nuclear weapon states, most of them, have quite a wide range of options for use of nuclear weapons to address conventional warfare, to prevent other weapons of mass destruction. No first use constrains that down. So again, we're helping to diffuse the risk of nuclear war. No first use does not imply that nuclear weapons will necessarily be used if there is a first use of nuclear weapons. It keeps that as an option, but other options are available. And we're seeing that playing out at the moment. We know that, like US military planners, if Russia, God forsake, decides to use a nuclear weapon, it doesn't mean that the United States will necessarily respond with a nuclear strike in response. There could be other options. Now, US doesn't even have a no first use policy at the moment, but we know that that thinking is in the military minds because no first use has been elevated so much in recent years through a number of ways. So it's part of the thinking within the US. And also, no first use and its companion sole purpose open the door to negotiations for nuclear disarmament. If you still have a whole range of uses for nuclear weapons, then you're not going to enter into negotiations to get rid of them because you believe you still need them for many different purposes. If they're only there to deter against nuclear weapons, then as long as the others with nuclear weapons enter into those negotiations, then you can work for nuclear disarmament as long as there's a verifiable and enforceable way of doing that. So it opens the door to bringing nuclear weapon states. So these are some of the reasons why it's a useful complement to other efforts for nuclear disarmament. It's not an alternative to, it can help facilitate nuclear disarmament. So now just get down to the next. So just a little bit about the platform that we have to advance this. No First Use Global is a platform, a network of over 80 organizations, plus many other individuals who are involved, advancing the idea of no first use as a nuclear risk reduction, nuclear war prevention, and nuclear disarmament facilitating measure. There have been various things that our network has been doing, various webinars, including defense, former nuclear weapons commanders, foreign defense ministers, legislators, academics, religious leaders. And again, what we're trying to do is build connections between the wonderful work that's been done by networks and organizations like Defuse Nuclear War in the United States, with also that in other nuclear weapon states. So it's not only the United States which is going towards no first use and nuclear disarmament. We want to also have the nuclear weapon states. And here are some of the other activities that have been involved with this. Number of appeals with many former high-level people signing, endorsing the bill, as well as civil society leaders. The most recent was fulfill the NPT from nuclear threats to human security, which we had over 1,500 influential endorsers. We saw from that some of our calls in the appeal made their way into the penultimate final draft of the NPT final outcome document, but then of course that wasn't adopted because there's no consensus. And then social media. And this is an action which some of the diffuse nuclear war members might like to do during this 2 weeks of action is nice social media action. Don't even think about starting a nuclear war. This is a sign that we got the idea from the signs in New York. Don't even think about parking here because there's so many illegal people parking. And that sort of went a little viral. So we changed the don't even think about parking here to don't even think about starting a nuclear war. You can download this little sign from the No First Use Global website, hold it in front of one of the embassies. Here we have them in front of the US, Russian, British, Chinese, and French embassies in Prague. You can do them in we've done them in other places as well. And that can be keeping the ball rolling in social media action. And then finally, we are continuing with an appeal which is this Unfold Zero, Protect People and the Planet appeal, which makes the connections between preventing nuclear war, adopting no first use policies, committing to the elimination of nuclear weapons in a specific time period, and then cutting the nuclear weapons budgets and putting that money into climate protection, into sustainable development, into human rights, into recovering from the pandemic, etc. And we invite you to endorse this if you haven't already. Once again, thank you so much. I think it's really good to build this cooperation with the movements that are working on peace, nuclear risk reduction, disarmament movements, and we look forward to building that cooperation with Diffuse Nuclear War. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and we certainly thank you for all the hard work that you're doing and your leadership in this movement, as well as we do urge all of our attendees to please look through diffusenuclearwar.org and find your closest picket line and join.
I now have the privilege of introducing Marcy Winograd. Marcy Winograd, coordinator of Code Pink Congress, is a longtime anti-war activist who served as a 2020 DNC delegate for Bernie Sanders and co-chairs the foreign policy team of Progressive Democrats of America. Marcy's activism began in high school when she marched against the Vietnam War and later joined the defense team of Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. Marcy, take it away.
Thank you so much, David. Roots Action, Hania, Vincent, powerful deliverance there. And I'm so honored to be back with Daniel Ellsberg today and Norman Solomon. I am the coordinator of Code Pink Congress, also more recently the coordinator of the Peace in Ukraine Coalition. This is a group of us, that Veterans for Peace, Code Pink, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, World Beyond War, Roots Action, and many other organizations that have come together to mobilize to address the most urgent threat right now, which is the threat of nuclear war resulting from this provoked war with Russia. And I say provoked because I just read a pretty powerful piece written by Caitlin Johnston on Substack, talking about how important it is to challenge this notion of unprovoked, because if you don't challenge it, then we should be fighting this endlessly, right? Because we are in the right, and this is an evil force that we must tackle until we're all gone, right? So that's something that I would like to bring your attention to. And I also want to share with you our thinking about going forward. We've had some weeks of action where we've been in front of Congress members' offices, delivering letters, ceasefire now, negotiate, do not escalate, no more weapons shipments to fan the flames of war in Ukraine. We want to now also focus on the media, getting in front of the offices of those that are promulgating all of this, agitating for war, MSNBC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times. So now would be a perfect time for you to join our Peace in Ukraine Coalition and also to join in some sort of action in front of a media institution. So if you're interested, I'm Marcy, M-A-R-C-Y at codepink.org, just email me. I also want to take a minute. I know I've only got 7, so I probably used up a couple. Anyway, I want to show you our Peace in Ukraine website so you can see some of what we've been doing. This is www.peaceinukraine.org. I invite every one of you to please sign up. Again, you can sign up here at the website or email me, marcy@codepink.org. Let's go to news and press. We click on news and press. We'll see September week of action. Let's just quickly take a look at what we finished up with. Whoops. Yeah. No. Okay. We want to go back to news and press and down to the bottom, September. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So we, Code Pink, we were on the steps of the Capitol, knocking on doors. There's nearly 100 members of the House Congressional Progressive Caucus. Who is voting against weapons in the Democratic Party for Ukraine? Not one person. Okay. Not, of course, these packages are linked, or they're combo packages with humanitarian aid, but we need our representatives to stand up and say no more weapons for endless war in Ukraine. So they knocked on 30 House doors, also took around a letter penned by Pramila Jayapal focusing on the need for negotiations. Let's keep going down. Madison, Wisconsin, San Pedro, California, in the offices of Congresswoman Nanette Berrigan. The next few were Boston area protests sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action, then San Francisco. You see there people lined up in front of the offices of, I think it was Senator Feinstein. They marched from Feinstein's office to Padilla's office to say, enough. Peace now in Ukraine. Go back to the negotiating table. Stop sabotaging these peace talks as you did in March. They're delivering in Philadelphia to the senators. In Rockville, Maryland, Veterans for Peace, where they have been arrested at different protests and direct action, Stop the War, Save the Climate. They're in a Congress member's office. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on the campus of Marquette University, handing out flyers with QR codes. Send a message to your congressperson. Publicly call for a ceasefire now in Ukraine. Santa Cruz, they made the local press. Here we are in Santa Barbara. I'm in Santa Barbara at our congressperson's office, also at a street corner delivering a letter to a staffer. Baltimore, Maryland, and on and on. And so we're coming up on our next meeting. This is Wednesday, just a couple of days from now. I invite you all to join us. We'll be talking about mobilizing in front of media offices and how to take immediate action to challenge this trajectory. And it is a very dangerous one, as Norman said in the opening. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcy. And everyone, that is Marcy Winograd, my mentor, someone who I've continued to work with for the past few years, who never stops, really. And it's an honor to be in the same space with you. She is the co-host and one of the founding members of Code Pink Congress, a program that is led by Medea Benjamin, Marcy Winograd, and I am just honored to be a part of the program that takes place twice a month. So I urge everyone to please get involved. It is my honor to introduce our next guest. Obviously, he is one of the youngest, most brilliant voices in the movement. Having said that, he couldn't be with us today, so we're going to be showing a video of his speech. His name is Hudi Peterson-Smith, who is a Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at IPS. He researches U.S. empire, borders, and migration. Hudi graduated from the Clark University Graduate School of the Geography in Massachusetts after completing a dissertation that focused on militarization and sovereignty. He is one of the co-authors and organizers of the 2015 Black Solidarity with Palestine statement, which was signed by over 1,100 Black activists and artists and scholars. Bill, please play his video, and thank you. We can't hear it.
Hello, I'm grateful to join you today by video, if not in real time. On this occasion, I'm thinking about the fact that when I was a little kid in my small hometown, I remember seeing air raid sirens on street poles and signs on buildings that said fallout shelter. I remember asking about them and being told by my mother, who remembered air raid drills and duck and cover, that these were in place to deal with the threat of nuclear weapons, but that they were this kind of anachronism, a holdover from the Cold War. And yet the weapons themselves never went away. did they? Even as these items, fallout shelter signs and air raid sirens, seemed like remnants, the US's own nuclear arsenal is something that was attended to, maintained. There were innovations, there was investment in new generations of nuclear weapons. And I think that we have to ask ourselves why. It's not enough to confront this reality, again, now more than ever, now that the threat of nuclear war looms in a renewed way. But we have to ask why these weapons have persisted, why the US's nuclear program has persisted. And I think that that points us to some important but uncomfortable truths, which is that nuclear weapons are not just the most egregious feature of American militarism. They're not just this extra thing. Actually, the whole notion of nuclear weapons, that a small group of people have within their hands the power to wield an unreal level of destruction, and that this kind of thing is affirmed not only in the belief in nuclear weapons, but in the actual practice of maintaining a nuclear arsenal over generations, this, I think, actually goes to something at the core of American identity. It is rooted in this notion of an American rationality, that the people who have the power to maintain a nuclear arsenal and to use nuclear weapons will do so in a rational and thoughtful and just way. And it is, I think, the height of American hubris. A hubris that is, of course, rooted in our own racialized histories and realities of this country. It is a white, male, American hubris. So these are some deep questions that I think we need to explore. Again, not only as we confront nuclear weapons and work to disarm, but as we ask the questions why we are still waging this fight so many years, decades, even generations after the advent of nuclear weapons. The other point I want to make is a simpler one. The unreal level of investment that this country has made in creating and maintaining a nuclear arsenal constitutes a crime against humanity, something that has been disproportionately experienced by the victims of the use of nuclear weapons and the testing of nuclear weapons, talking about our indigenous relatives on this continent and in the Pacific and throughout the world, really. It also represents a crime, of course, against our planet, and it represents a theft from this society. It's remarkable that, once again, we are talking about how this country cannot afford to forgive student debt, that years into a pandemic that is ongoing, and as new pandemics emerge, we still don't have a national healthcare system, and we're told that we can't afford it. And yet, for generations, policymakers have invested in nuclear weapons. So these are the things that I hope we keep in mind as we continue and really take up, in a new moment, the fight against nuclear weapons. Because at the end of the day, nuclear disarmament, it's not just about, again, getting rid of the worst features or this kind of extra feature of US militarism. It's about a bigger question, which is, at the end of the day, what kind of world do we want to live in? Let's fight for a better one. Thank you.
Terrific. Glad we got the video to include. It's now my pleasure to introduce Susan Mirsky, who is the chair of MAPA, or Massachusetts Peace Action's Nuclear Disarmament Working Group, and on the board of Massachusetts Peace Action. She has been involved with issues of nuclear disarmament since 1959 as a high school student. She is also involved with a local peace group in Newton, Massachusetts, Newton Dialogues on Peace and War. She has had a long career in early intervention as an early childhood specialist and has taught modern dance for children and adults in a community setting. I hope we're about to learn some right now. Susan.
Well, thank you. um, as a disclaimer, I don't think of myself as a great speaker, and I don't have anything prepared for you all. So I apologize for that, but I'm just going to speak from my heart and my experience. I put that bit in about being involved with nuclear weapons in high school because this was in 1959. Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy had started, but we as high schoolers felt that the adults didn't know what they were talking about really, and that we as high schoolers, we really knew. So I sometimes take that memory of that experience and I think we need to engage with youth, but we need to really listen to what youth are thinking. And so that has been most helpful for me. My involvement in nuclear weapons at this point with mass peace action is varied. Everybody talks about wanting or needing a movement, that no one organization is going to do it. And we talk about, okay, so how do we start a movement? How do we get people to recognize that this is a moment of emergency? And it's hard. I mean, I don't have the answers, but I think that this program and these speakers and the discussion that follows, all of you who are listening are going to feed that sense of, or give some thoughts as to how we start a movement. It's hard. We talk about the absolute existential threat of nuclear weapons, and right now it is coming upon us. And I talked with my son about this, and when I talked with him about it in terms of, hey mom, what are you doing? I saw his eyes sort of glaze over and he looked worried because he was working very hard. His wife was working. He had 2 young kids. This was in the middle of COVID. So he had to be dealing with health, how to keep his family fed and emotionally happy or sane. I go out, I leaflet, and I talk with people who have multiple problems. In my work, I put that bit about the work that I do because I worked with people who had multiple problems, and nuclear war was not high up there. They could not deal with that thought of the end of the world. It was just too much. So how do we get people to understand this? How do we try to reach people who don't necessarily think like us, who have not been involved with the issue of nuclear weapons? And that is our task. There are so many groups that we work with. We work with WILF, Women's League for International League for Peace and Freedom. wonderful group. We work with the TPNW. I'm on the localities and legislators group. This is trying to get people within communities all over the country to go to their local leaders and try to get the I Can pledge signed, or the Back from the Brink resolution signed, or get them to be the mayors, to be mayors for peace. We go to communities of faith. That's most important. We work with working with now the Vets for Peace and Alice, see you there. Working with advertising the Golden Rule boat, and also getting our legislators to go to that event in Bethesda, Maryland. In Mass Peace Action and the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group, we have some subgroups. We have the TPNW subgroup, and that group right now is working legislatively. We have a Nuclear Weapons Commission bill. Also to say, we work with nuclearban.us, great resource. And that's just within our state, for our state legislature, just to look at how our state is going to respond to all the ways in which nuclear weapons affect the residents of Massachusetts. We have a group that is a public engagement group, and they have been trying to identify all of the peace groups, peace social justice groups within Massachusetts. They are working on the Golden Rule. They have been working on many other issues. Right now, we have a brand new campaign working with the Raytheon anti-war group. So it's a Raytheon nuclear weapons campaign. And we had the wonderful Susie Snyder come and speak with us, talking about corporations and how corporations right here in the Boston area, in the western part of the state, L3 Harris, making nuclear weapons. And we want people in our state to be aware of this. So we work with organizations within our state and national organizations. And thank you, Alan Ware, for the work that you do to bring us international news, Global Zero, Unfold Zero, Youth Fusion. Get a lot of ideas and a lot of feedback. I put that little bit about, that I taught dance, because I think that there are many ways that people understand and get the message about the dangers of nuclear weapons and about all kinds of our issues. And whether it's through movement or through the arts, through music, through art, and Vincent, I think you spoke to this. Different people hear our message in different ways. So we need to use this all. We go to our legislators where we are working to support now our wonderful Jim McGovern's new bill, which is basically a Back from the Brink bill. Working on that. All kinds of things that we are doing. We go back and forth. Do we, let's see, how is my time doing? I have to check. All right. Okay.
Maybe another minute would be great.
One more minute. Okay. How do we focus our energy? Do we work legislatively, or do we work on movement building within our communities? And I guess our answer is both. We do both. We looked at one point, books, not bombs, mines, not missiles, subways, not submarines, any way in which we can. And now through this new effort, Diffuse Nuclear War, we are going to be working on both legislatively and both. And I just want to end. Susie Snyder is so good. She put humor and valuable information in one fell swoop. But I just want to end. I saw on TV Dr. Strangelove a few weeks ago. Now, I've seen it many times, and I'm sure the rest of you have seen it many times too. But this time, when I saw that cowboy go down with the bomb and seeing those mushroom clouds go up one after the other, I could not help but start to cry. And I could not stop crying for many hours. And I thought about my children, my grandchildren, your children, your grandchildren. And it was hard. It was very hard. And so I'm sorry to leave you on that sad note, but it's so good to be working with you all for the end of nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Susan, so much for that powerful speech. I don't know what you're talking about. You're not a good speaker. You're a wonderful speaker. And something to what you do is coming from Iran. I grew up during the time of war. And I cannot tell you how much art therapy helped me leave the trauma behind. And that was through drawing and as well as dance. So thank you, Susan, for the work that you do in that arena. Giving it to Ryan Black to take us to our next segment before we hear from the man of the hour, Mr. Daniel Ellsberg.
Thank you very much, Hanya. Directed by Oscar nominee Judith Ehrlich, the Diffuse Nuclear War podcast with Daniel Ellsberg explores the dangers of nuclear weapons and the politics that drive their existence. The podcast lets you hear firsthand accounts from Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg about his time as a nuclear war planner for the U.S. military and learn the hidden truth about the realities of nuclear weapons. The first 2 episodes are available on YouTube and on diffusenuclearwar.org in video form, and also pretty much anywhere else you listen to podcasts in audio form. We are excited to bring to you the next episodes in the series here for the first time, and starting next week, they'll be available anywhere you can get podcasts, on diffusenuclearwar.org and on YouTube. So Bill, if you have those queued up.
Since the end of the Cold War, people have been focused on the possibility of a terrorist nuclear attack or an accident or some rogue nation using nuclear weapons. They are not focused and worried about the possibility of an all-out nuclear war between the US and Russia. For 40 years now, with the end of the Cold War, people really haven't thought about that very much. Those who do follow it, they know it would be catastrophic, that the chance of an all-out war, the use of most of our missiles, strategic bombers on both sides, is possible. It is not zero possibility, and it's not near zero possibility. We have 400 missiles on 10-minute alert. From getting an authenticated command to the time that the missiles are actually launched from their silos is a matter of minutes. Those missiles, of course, cannot be recalled. In about 30 minutes, they would land at their targets, largely in Russia and China. Since the mid-60s, the Russians, the Soviets, acquired sub-launched missiles, which our ICBMs could not target, and which assured that whether we went first or second, the Soviets had the ability to demolish our society, just as we had the ability to demolish theirs. From that time on, the vulnerability of the ICBMs made them extremely dangerous for us to possess, and we should have eliminated them half a century ago. What makes any conflict enormously more dangerous than it has to be even now after half a century of ideology and deception and irresponsible behavior is the ICBMs, which increase the danger that any armed conflict between major nuclear states can escalate to all-out war.
Wow. I have to say, I was very selfish, and I'll say this, I'll admit this, David, because I made it so that I get to introduce our next speaker, who happens to be Daniel Ellsberg. I say it now in front of everybody. I am just honored, and I thank you so much, Daniel, from the bottom of my heart for the work that you've been doing and for your movement building and your leadership. Daniel Ellsberg is a former consultant to the Defense Department and the White House, especially in problems of the command and control of nuclear weapons, nuclear war plans, and crises decision-making. He later joined the Defense Department and then the State Department. In 1969, he photocopied the 7,000-page top secret McNamara studies, which later became known as the Pentagon Papers, and gave it to the State and Foreign Relations Committee. In 1971, he gave it to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. Ellsberg's subsequent trial, 12 felony count posing a possible sentence of 115 years, was dismissed in 1973 on the grounds of governmental misconduct against him, leading to the convictions of several White House aides and figuring in the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon. Ellsberg has been a lecturer, scholar, writer, and an activist on dangers of nuclear era, wrongful US interventions, of the urgent need for patriotic whistleblowing. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
For me. We're hearing a great deal right now of the question, might Vladimir Putin use a nuclear weapon in the Ukraine conflict? Might he, in the words that we've heard earlier in this program, and it's often described this way, break a norm against using them for the first time since Nagasaki? Actually, that can be answered. Putin has used his nuclear weapons. 7 months ago, at the very onset in February of the attack into Ukraine, Putin announced that he was sitting in an underground bunker in Russia, watching the exercise of actually all three components of his nuclear arsenal, as we call it, our triad: the submarine launch missile, an ICBM, and a bomber. I think he had cruise missiles involved in there too. He was using the weapon in the way that you use a pistol when you point it at somebody's head in a conflict, whether or not you pull the trigger. And if you get your way without pulling the trigger, that's the best use of the weapon. You couldn't make that confrontation and that threat without having the weapon. And that's the major rationale for having them. The ability to wear it on your hip, as NATO has done for nearly 70 years now, or over 70 years, or to pull it out of the holster and point it in the head, as we've done a couple of dozen times, detailed in my book, The Doomsday Machine, as Putin is doing right now. Now, the effect of his doing that very clearly was to underline the importance of President Biden's commitment not to put US troops into the Ukraine. And for NATO, and Biden has fortunately observed that in the face of these threats, which I would say are effective, without Soviet, or I should say Russian nuclear weapons now, they inherited the Soviet nuclear weapons. Without those, if you can imagine this aggression taking place in Ukraine, NATO, or individually or together, or even as NATO, would almost surely be confronting the Russians in Ukraine with American air power directly, and even very, very possibly troops. So he's getting his way in that particular one. but now it's getting a little tighter. In between, Putin has said several times that they would not use nuclear weapons by Russian doctrine, current doctrine, unless the integrity or existence of Russia was threatened. But a few days ago, he extended the boundaries of Russia into the entire Donetsk, the entire Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, large parts of which Ukrainians occupy at this point. They are in effect under Putin's announcement of annexing them just the other day, occupying Russian territory at this point, not merely an ally, not merely republics that Putin recognized as supposedly independent just before he invaded in February, but now they're part of Russia. So that this notion of an existential threat, to all of Russia? To part of Russia, the integrity of Russia, enables him in terms of Russian doctrine to initiate the use of nuclear weapons, to defend what he now regards as Russia. And we've been seeing for some weeks now that was a possibility if the Ukrainians extended their a few uses they've made of attacks actually on Russian territory from which the attacks come, more or less edging very close to inviting Russian attacks on the transportation sites of material into Ukraine from Poland and elsewhere, which would mean a direct confrontation with NATO. Well, we're right at that point right now. Why are we not hearing from the world at large, and specifically from the US public, that's an outrageous, immoral, vicious, horrendous threat, which has no legitimacy? That shouldn't be made. The entire world is threatened by such a threat, given the very large, not certain, but very large propensity of an exchange at the tactical level, the short range, relatively small warhead level, with which both Russia is armed with about 2,000 tactical weapons, and NATO has about 100 to 150 US tactical weapons in Europe at this point. It's understood by nearly everybody that such an exchange would be highly likely to escalate to an all-out exchange, which threatens every nation, every person in the world, in the light of nuclear winter, which we've known about for 30 years now as a prospect. The possibility then that attacks, burning cities, would launch smoke from the cities into the stratosphere, where it would not rain out, where it would go around the world quickly, threatening even, not just threatening even the southern hemisphere as well as the north, with the devastation of all harvests, freezing rivers in the summer and whatnot, but in particular, cutting off this food supply for the world population, so that a recent study has said that more than 5 billion people would die of starvation, aside from the more immediate effects of radiation, blast, fire, and so forth. So, in other words, the whole world is witnessing a superpower in terms of nuclear weapons threatening them. And yet, how many of them are really protesting that? Well, actually, some did on Friday in the UN discussion, the Congo, for example, and several others. But how come this is not a worldwide movement saying this is an absolutely reprehensible and unacceptable proposition, threat, it could not be an option, and so forth? Well, the answer is easy to make. The US and its NATO allies have been using their nuclear weapons since the early 50s. That's almost 70 years entirely, and they've been doing it throughout that period, have totally rejected the notion of no first use, of saying that the nuclear option is not on the table, that we will under no circumstances initiate nuclear war. As a matter of fact, I don't expect Biden to make such a statement even under pressure, which he could afford to do in Europe now, unlike the way we saw it in the early 60s, when it was assumed that Russia and its Warsaw Pact allies, greatly outnumbered, were greatly superior to NATO conventional forces in Europe. And so that in those days, they said the US role in Europe, hegemony, basically, our involvement in their economic councils, in their trade pacts and everything else, and above all their military, rested on our readiness and explicit threat and preparation to initiate nuclear war against even an entry into Berlin, which was West Berlin, 100 miles inside East Germany, and a readiness to do that. I was in the Pentagon when such threats were being made in 1961. The shoe is on the other foot in Europe at this point. The Warsaw Pact minus Russia changed sides. It's entirely, almost entirely in NATO right now. So the conventional balance is changed. And therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that this Eisenhower-initiated, and Truman had it before that, policy of the new look of supposedly of a reliance on massive retaliation has now shifted to Russia. And over the last half century, the US has done nothing, quite the contrary, to delegitimize such a threat, even when, to say nothing of the last 30 years when the Warsaw Pact shifted over, when it has no need for that in Europe. So why wouldn't Biden say at this point, we will not initiate nuclear war under any circumstances? And yes, we've made that threat in the past, but how to say this? Not easy to write this speech, actually, for the president. We see the light. Somehow a conversion of some kind has taken place here. And we're now saying what the rest of the world has said for 40 years. This is an absolutely unacceptable threat. And the reason I think he was not to be expected to do that is that he would be denounced from the right, and not only the right, from the Democratic politicians like Nancy Pelosi, and even someone who has been on the right side of the nuclear issue for most of his time, Senator Ed Markey, and others who will say you were virtually inviting an attack into Taiwan from China, because there, after a Chinese buildup over the last 20 years, we don't have regional superiority in the vicinity of Taiwan in conventional terms. So that threat of US initiation will be at the least implicit and very possibly explicit. And Biden is unlikely, extremely unlikely, to say nuclear war should not be initiated under any circumstances any more than any of his predecessors has ever said, because he's about to use it in Taiwan. Now, the fact is that is an unacceptable situation. I'm afraid I've used up my time here. Is that right? So I wanted to say more on that subject, but I'll just wrap that up by saying, yes, it is half a century past due for the countries, including the NATO allies and the US countries, who all have rejected the idea of denouncing first use before, which was a UN resolution exactly. I can't refer, even it'll take a minute here, if I may. UN resolution 36/100, December 1981, reflecting first use threats by Reagan, reiterating Carter's first use threats from the Carter Doctrine in the Middle East. And the UN was scared enough by that proposal to make this resolution on behalf of its members, which 82 nations affirmed. States and statesmen that resort first to the use of nuclear weapons will be committing the gravest crime against humanity. I printed this down just minutes ago while the others were talking. There will never be any justification or pardon for statesmen who take the decision to be the first to use nuclear weapons. Any doctrines allowing the first use of nuclear weapons and any actions pushing the world towards the catastrophe, which we're seeing on both sides right now, are incompatible with human moral standards and the lofty ideals of the United Nations. It is the supreme duty and direct obligation of the leaders of nuclear weapon states to act in such a way as to eliminate the risk of the outbreak of a nuclear conflict. Now, who could really object to that resolution now? Well, I have to tell you, I also downloaded the yeses and nos on that one. 82 formed that. 19 states led by the United States, all the members of NATO, plus Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, by the way, voted no. We don't agree that that would be a crime against humanity. We don't. Would they change that today? Couldn't count on it. Only a public announcement of the positions of the U.S. and NATO, and on the one hand, and Russia imitating the exact same doctrine, on the other hand, could possibly change the situation. The leaders will not do it. And it's an obvious, a statement of morality. The day after, or days after, Carter had announced this doctrine, which led a military action in the Persian Gulf in 1980, that a press conference was held with the Secretary of State, the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Information. William Dias was asked at a press conference to explain this talk of military action, and the question was, in nuclear war, are we committed not to make the first strike? Dias, Assistant Secretary, no, sir. Question, we could conceivably make an offensive? Dias, we make no comment on that whatsoever, but the Soviets know that this terrible weapon has been dropped on human beings twice in history, and it was an American president who dropped it both times. Therefore, they have to take this into consideration in their calculus. Well, he was right about that, wasn't he? Putin, the Soviets did know. Putin, now a Russian, not a Soviet, announced 2 days ago that the precedent for the threats he's making now was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said that created a precedent, and so it did. A precedent of legitimacy, of that it was right, that it was moral. The American people in my lifetime have been led to believe falsely that there was a defense of necessity for the use of those weapons, that it was moral and legitimate. They were wrong. The premises that was based on were false. They've been led that, but we've been acting on it ever since. In short, for 70 years, we have been reaping, sowing the wind. And the harvest is looking at us right now, the reaping of that. And it is for us, because our leaders on both sides have properly been characterized as threatening the greatest, by the UN, threatening the greatest crime in human history. And it's up to us to stop them from doing that.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And there are a number of requests here in the chat that if you have the link to the resolution, if you could share that with our audience member, it would be fantastic. I'll hand it back to Ryan to play the second clip.
Yeah, real quick, Bill, if you can cue up that second video, we have another episode from the Defuse Nuclear War podcast, and here it is.
Remember that Hillary Clinton campaigned on the question of who the public wanted to respond to a 3 a.m. warning that Soviet missiles were on the way. It's the ICBMs alone that create this 3 a.m. 10-minute warning situation. If we eliminated those, then there would be no jamming, to use their word, jamming the president to act very swiftly. Now, it isn't only the president. It's not only Trump or Biden who could launch those weapons as president. People think that's only the president, and that's not true. In fact, there's a number of places that could actually deliver that command, and of course, it could be done without authorization. So there's a lot of fingers on a lot of buttons in the world, and that has been kept very secret from the public so as not to worry them. No human has ever existed who should have that responsibility or have that capability. Actually, not only not in 10 minutes, not in 10 weeks, not in 10 months. No one should have that capability to destroy most life on Earth, or a third of life on Earth, or a tenth. Our entire framework of nuclear weapons is based on the idea, bad as it would be to strike first, it's less bad than to strike second. Very plausible. The Air Force doctrine, strategic doctrine, everything tells us that, and we build weapons to destroy enemy weapons as though they could limit damage to the United States if they went first before they were themselves destroyed. But it's not true. No, it is not better to go first than second. There is no possibility to limit damage any more than there is a possibility to win. We're continuing year by year, deliberately, with a posture and a policy and threats that make significant risk of near extinction possible any month, any year. We are now making threats of war over Taiwan that could lead to nuclear war with China, threats in Ukraine. And by the way, it's not only the US. The idea of war between the US and Russia or the US and China, which both sides are preparing for, should not be a human prospect, but it is.
Terrific videos and terrific live presentation, a number of live presentations today that should be turned into videos. My pleasure now, it is my privilege to introduce, I think, our final speaker, Alice Slater, who serves on the boards of World Beyond War and the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Alice is the UN NGO representative of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, a member of the Global Council of Abolition 2000, an advisory board member of Nuclear Ban US, supporting the mission of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work in realizing the successful UN negotiations for a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. As a member of the Lawyers Alliance for Nuclear Arms Control, Alice Slater traveled to Russia and China on numerous delegations engaged in ending the arms race and banning the bomb. She is a member of the New York City Bar Association and served on the People's Climate Committee, New York City, working for 100% green energy by 2030. Alice Slater, welcome. The floor is yours. And you're muted.
And I'm turning on my clock if it works, so that I won't talk for much more than 7 minutes. It's a hard act to follow, Dan. I mean, he really laid it out, but what's really missing in our national conversation is the truth about our relationship with Russia, the Soviet Union, and Russia going back to World War I, when Woodrow Wilson sent troops to help the White Russians against the communist revolution. There was no Stalin then. We're talking about the corporate patriarchy that's in its last gasps now, because not only is it proliferating nuclear weapons, and Obama, the Harvard constitutional law scholar, started a deal for $1 trillion over the next 20 years for new bomb factories, missiles, airplanes, submarines, that Trump upped the ante and Biden did too. So it has nothing to do with good government or bad. They're all bad. And Ray McGovern, who was the CIA briefer for Bush and Clinton, said, he left and formed VIPs, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And he says it's not the military industrial complex that Eisenhower spoke about. It's the Mickey Mac. Ray, what's the Mickey Mac? The military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academic think tank complex. We are under a barrage of brainwashing. You can't talk about Russia in a reasonable way. You have to hate Putin. They have to be miserable. And it's all media baloney. So I think we have to go forward. First of all, Putin gave a big speech on Friday after he announced, after their elections in the Donbass, where they voted to go back to Russia. And the way it was reported in my New York Times, it made me cry to read the newspaper. I mean, they didn't give anything of his speech. So I've put a link to Putin's speech in the chat. And if you're on this call, I beg you to read that speech, because we've got to know where Russia is coming from. Like the work now, there are 13,000 nukes on the planet, 12,000 are in the US and Russia. All the other 7 countries only have 1,000 between them. So it's really up to us and Russia. And look at what we're doing with them, what the media is doing. We're making them into such an enemy, you can't even talk to them. And the bottom line, which I will quote from Putin's speech, which he gave on Friday, is he called for, we call on the Kiev regime to immediately cease fire and all hostilities, to end the war unleashed back in 2014 and return to the negotiating table. We are ready for this, as we said more than once. And the US has discouraged any talk between Kiev and Russia. And 2 weeks before he invaded, he announced, this is my red line, no Ukraine in NATO, and let the Donbass, which he now announces part of Russia, but he was more reasonable that they had these Minsk agreements, because the Kiev government that we helped overthrow, it's all in Putin's speech, which sent the Azov brigade into Donbass with their Nazi swastikas. And by the way, Russia lost 27 million Russians to the Nazi onslaught. I mean, I'm Jewish. We talk about the 6 million Jews forever. Does anybody ever hear 27 million Russians died in World War II? And when I went there, every guy over 60 is wearing his World War II medals. They're so traumatized by this. So here we are expanding NATO when we promised Gorbachev. I mean, not only did Woodrow Wilson send troops, then when the wall came, there was like a miracle. They let go of all of Eastern Europe without a shot. And Gorbachev was very nervous about a reunited Germany going into NATO. And Reagan said, don't worry, let Germany reunite and go into NATO. We give you our word. We will not expand NATO 1 inch to the east. And who expanded it? Clinton. For the first time, we disobeyed our agreement in the United Nations Security Council that if there was a veto, you couldn't do it. We wanted to bomb the other side in Serbia, Kosovo, you know, there was that fight there. And Clinton and Russia vetoed it. And Clinton just took his NATO troops and went and bombed the crap out of Kosovo against the UN vote. And that was like the opening misery. And then he started expanding it, taking everybody in. And everybody put more in. Trump put, you know, Biden put another country in, and then it came up right up to their border, Ukraine. And it's good that we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because do you think for a minute we would allow Russia to put troops in Canada or Mexico on our border, and they do military war games, including nuclear war games on Russia's border? This is going on now all the time. As a matter of fact, in I think it was 2011, Putin just gave up about us ever, you know, doing anything to not expand NATO, and asked if Russia could join NATO, and we turned him down. So Russia's not the enemy. It's like Walt Kelly had this Pogo comic strip in the 50s during the Red Scare saying, we met the enemy and he is us. Russia is not the enemy, and that's our job in the peace movement, to get this word out about the truth. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a group that started in America about the Cold War Truth Commission. Because not only did we break our promise to Gorbachev about not expanding NATO, he said to Reagan when they met in Reykjavik, let's get rid of all the nukes. Reagan said, great idea. Gorbachev says, don't do Star Wars. Reagan says, I'm not giving up Star Wars. And Russia and China put a resolution into the UN and the committee. My time is up, guys. On disarmament, I'll just finish this thought. to ban weapons in space, and they keep putting another one in to ban cyber war after we boasted about our Stuxnet virus with Israel, where we blew up Iran's enrichment facilities. Obama turned him down. Clinton turned him down. We do not allow it to be discussed in the UN, the United States of America. We are the bad bully on the block, and this is our job, to get this truth out, to get through. It's not, our best friends are telling us it's all Russia's fault. I can't talk to my kids. They think I'm crazy, So that's my appeal, that we figure out how to get out this message of who did what to who, and get Americans educated so we can deal with Russia on a reasonable, rational basis and get rid of the nukes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alice. Wonderful presentation. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. And I do want to hand it over to Ryan Black, my colleague, to talk about what we have planned for October 14th, which is our picket lines, day of action, as well as October 16th, where you get to plan your own day of action. So Ryan, please take it away.
Yeah, like Hania said at the start of the program, October 2022 marks the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union and US engaged in a tense standoff over the installation of nuclear weapons in Cuba. It is widely considered the closest the two superpowers ever came to a nuclear war until now. In recognition of the anniversary, Defuse Nuclear War has made October a month of action to say no to nukes. On Friday, October 14th, join an informational picket line at your House members or senator's local office to demand that they truly make efforts to significantly reduce the risk of nuclear war. There are 15 pickets planned across the country so far, with several others in the works. Find one near you or start your own at diffusenuclearwar.org. On Sunday, October 16th, engage with your community about the dangers of nuclear weapons via demonstrations, flyering, and banner drops. Grab a banner and some signs available for free from Defuse Nuclear War and make your demands seen and heard. I just sent a banner out to somebody this morning who's having it printed. We had 40 signs out in Seattle last week. They look fantastic. You can find all that info, signs to print, flyers, graphics to share on social media at diffusenuclearwar.org. And I urge you, please get involved on the 14th or the 16th or both, or find something near you. And let's make sure our communities know that we want to diffuse nuclear war. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. David, I guess this is our goodbye. So go for it.
Well, luckily, it's not the goodbye that ends Dr. Strangelove, but it's goodbye only for the moment. But wonderful event, Hanya, wonderful, Ryan, everybody, terrific job. And I know there are lots of questions that came in through the chat that we probably need to answer, and we'll work on doing that. But it's absolutely incredible that in 40 years we've gone from everybody being concerned about this, but it not really happening, to pretty much blissful obliviousness, and it's actually happening. And I know which I prefer, but if your priority is short term, if you're narrowing your vision the way that our attention spans are narrowed, you may have a different preference in that choice of those two situations, and we got to work on changing that, waking people up. So get this video from Ryan or somebody as soon as it's finished here, and share it widely.
And we're going to have the video, as David mentioned, on diffusenuclearwar.org. We advise you to please, we suggest that you check out our website, find your nearest picket line, and join this movement with us. And I also want to thank from the bottom of my heart Norman Solomon for bringing this vision to life and really extending an invitation to over 95 organizations to co-sponsor this movement with us. You truly are a legend, and you are just a wonderful person. Thank you, Norman, for this opportunity. We say goodbye to you. We thank you for being here. Have a beautiful rest of your Sunday, and towards justice. Bye.